Hey, I'd like to welcome you to another episode of Mission Matters. My name is Adam Torres, and if you'd like to apply to be a guest in the show, just head on over to missionmatters.com and click on Be Our Guest to Apply. All right, so I have a very special episode today. I have Will Pearson on the line. He's president over at iHeart Podcast, and we're going to get and pick his brain on podcasting, where we're at in podcasting, what's the potential for podcasting in the future. I mean, a totally unique vantage point, in my opinion, being with a president over at iHeart Podcast, because that's a high vantage point, leaders in podcasting. So, Will, first off, just want to say welcome to the show.
Thanks, Adam. I've really been looking forward to the conversation.
All right, Will, it's fun to have you on this show, and we got a lot to cover, but we start every episode with what we like to call our Mission Matters Minute. So, Will, at Mission Matters, our aim is to amplify stories for entrepreneurs, executives, and experts. That's our mission. Will, what mission matters to you?
The mission I think that matters most to me is helping as many people as we can find joy. And I mean that in many, many different ways, whether that's through family. We've got our families very close to the autism community, for example. So many members of our family are heavily involved in a few different autism related organizations that spend as much time as they can helping those in the autism community find support, find joy. We do the same thing with organizations in the LGBTQ community, the same thing with organizations and wish granting organizations that help kids sort of realize dreams when they may be in difficult situations medically or health wise. And so I think we can all go through life doing what we can to help others find joy. We certainly find that in ourselves.
Amazing. Love bringing mission-based individuals on the line to share, why they do, what motivates them, what drives them and makes them, tick. Because it's sometimes easy to see, the outward of what's going on with people, but I'd love to see the inward too. So thanks for sharing that. And again, awesome to have you on. So, Will, just to get us
Thank
kicked
you.
off here, I did a lot of looking into your background, was excited to have you on the show. You have a unique vantage point. Let's get into kind of the beginning though. Where did whether it's podcasting, it could be entertainment in general, what drew you to this in general? How'd you get here?
Yeah, it was an interesting timing for us because I was at a company that I had founded in college, I guess back in 2001 with a college
Mm,
roommate of mine, and it was called Mental Floss, and it was in the world of trivia, general knowledge, more in the magazine and digital space. And we had sold the company, and the two of us as founders were starting to think about, what is the next thing we want to get involved in? And we had been paying attention to this space that people were talking about of podcasting. And it had been around for, let's say 7 or 8, 9 years of people starting to listen to these, but it was still felt like very early
what
days.
year
This
was
was
this? Just
around,
approximate. Yeah.
oh, this was around 2015, I would say, that we
Okay.
started
Wow.
thinking about what's happening in the world of podcasting. So again, for those longtime podcast listeners, they'd say, "Oh, come on, podcasting was about a decade old by that
Yeah.
point." But if we're all being honest with ourselves, a very small percentage of the U.S. population was listening to podcasts at that point. And so we looked at it
Absolutely.
and thought, there's something really interesting going on here, and it feels like this is a category that's going to grow. And we started
Mm,
having conversations with this company called Stuff Media, or sometimes more publicly known is How Stuff Works. And they had been publishing some of the longest running podcasts in the general knowledge space, shows like
mm.
Stuff You Should Know, Stuff You Missed in History Class, Tech Stuff. Fortunately, at some point they learned that you didn't have to put the word stuff in every single podcast title, but there were some just great shows that were building these really loyal audiences, and it was
Mm.
fascinating to us. And we'd wanted to try to jump back into the entrepreneurial space and jump back into a category that felt like it was in its very early stages. And so we started having these conversations with Stuff Media that asked us to come on board and help, see what we could do to spin off the podcast division and see if we could grow it and what would
Mm.
happen. And we decided to give it a go. And so the podcast division spun off from the How Stuff Works website and their other ventures. And I guess it was about 18 months later or so, we sold this company to iHeart Media, and we're
Mm.
brought on board to help run the podcast division at iHeart. But that's where it came about. Wasn't exactly something I saw coming, but it's been a really exciting ride.
So it's so interesting to me, like when people think or when podcasting first comes on their radar, especially if you're a new podcast listener, because it's been my experience,
Yeah,
like for a new podcast listener, once it's like they discover this treasured trove of content and they're like, oh my gosh, I didn't know that this existed. And the loyalty and the real audiences, I'll give you my bias, Will, not putting this on you, but my company, we put all of our resources in podcasting. I've done over 6,000 interviews myself. We've launched over
wow,
150 shows, and this is just in the last 8 years. So we're new to this game. And the reason is because unlike I'll give you my view on this and then I'd love to hear your opinion. But
yeah,
unlike any other medium, to me, I have this different type of connection with hosts, like even as a
hmm,
personal listener. So, for example, Instagram, I like Instagram, not picking on it. So, if you're listening to this, don't
right,
email me. I like Instagram. I love Instagram. Fine. But if you follow me on Instagram, if you give me a little like, okay, great. Then, you got a certain amount of value. That took a millisecond, a second, whatever it
that's
took,
right.
right? But if somebody like takes the time to listen to content that we put out and we produce and all this, and you spend a half an hour of your life on listening to
Yes.
an episode, and then not just us, but just in general, when I invest that time in shows that I listen to, like there's a connection there. So it just has a different experience, a different feel to me than any other medium. What do you think makes podcasting magic? Like, what do you think?
Well, I mean, I do want to speak to something else with respect to that. However, I think you make a point that really is worth doubling down on because
Mm,
people do not think about this. In the world of social media, in the world of video, in so
hmm.
many other spaces, the word force is probably not too strong of a word, but it
Yeah.
is easy to get content in front of people. With
Yes.
podcasting, it is so many steps of intentionality
Mm,
to get somebody to listen to a thing that when somebody's there to listen to it, I mean, if you think about it, you have to be on a podcast platform.
yeah.
You have to decide, I'm interested in this specific show. You then
Hmm.
have to decide, I want to listen to this episode. There's all these steps that people are very consciously doing a thing. So, with that in
Yeah.
mind, when somebody's listening to a podcast episode, they want to be there. And if
Mm,
they don't like it, they won't come back. And so you've got to bring in a new listener. So when you hear about podcasts that are generating millions of downloads and streams every single
mm.
month, I mean, that is a loyal fan base. And I
Yeah.
think that sort of segues into what I do find most special about this
Mm,
podcast industry. I think the word, intimate can sometimes be overused a little bit, but it is probably the best way to describe the relationship of, a podcast listener and this audience. I mean, when they're listening to you host
yeah.
this podcast, they're there for you. They're there because they love hearing you in
Yeah.
conversation. They love hearing you talk about things, and they're there for your wisdom and your personality. And that relationship that listeners build with their podcast host and the talent that they follow is unlike anything I've seen across every
Hmm.
single category. And that's one of the most fun parts of what we do here at iHeart is we get to think about shows really across every single category in podcasting, no matter the category. It is just amazing to watch this bond that forms between
Yeah.
the podcast listener and the host.
And Will, I love that you said the word intimate because I don't know if I've ever said this on the podcast, but I know I say it amongst friends and other things because it doesn't just come up in natural conversation. But in natural conversation with friends, I use the word intimate and I say it is the podcasting is the most intimate
Yeah.
type of experience you can have. And the reason why is because it's physical. If you think about the way
Yeah.
most people listen, they have earbuds in their ears. And so
Yep.
you're literally in an orifice, and just based off of it being a passive listening experience, where YouTube,
Yep.
okay, you might listen to YouTube sometimes in your earbuds or something, but normally you're going to watch it. It might be on a desktop, your TV, something else. So you're
That's
not
right.
literally plugged in. But for a
Yep.
podcast listener, like you're literally putting that host in your ears when you're running, when you're jogging, when you're doing something else, like
Yeah.
a lot of listener behavior. So to me, I feel like that vibration, there is an actual intimate connection over time. like years. If you
I
think
agree.
about, I can think about some of my cousins maybe that I don't talk to every week.
Yeah.
If I listen to a podcast every week, technically speaking, I'm spending more time with that host during my workout than I am with family that I love and that are my blood. Like literally.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And on that note, there's
Mm,
two things that have really been surprising or interesting to witness happening over the last few years in podcasting that sort of speak to that. I think most people assume that podcasts are very much an on the go media, meaning
mm,
when you're commuting, when you're in your car, when you're
hmm.
out. And of course, there is a good bit of that. But actually, over the past few years, there's been a very real shift to where now about 70% or so, maybe a little bit less of podcast listening is happening at home. People are
Mm.
doing this when they're cooking dinner. People are doing this when they're on the Peloton. People are doing this when
Wow.
they're actually just sort of winding down and
So
sitting
kind of how
down in the
TV
den at
used to
night.
be. Am I wrong? Like
That's
kind of like
right.
how
That's
TV
right.
used to be like you get home and you just by habit turn on the TV, like let's just say in another generation when that was the main thing. Then you put it on, you're
That's right.
cooking, whatever. So you're inviting those hosts, into your living room because while you're listening to it in the background while you're cooking. And so now it's like the
That's
host is at
exactly
dinner with
right.
you. Oh, that's amazing.
That's
I didn't know
exactly
that.
right. And so it's interesting to see this because now visualize what you just described as it
Hmm.
happens at home. So somebody is sitting down on the couch at night before they're winding down for the evening. And instead of turning on the TV, they're listening to a podcast. It doesn't get much more intimate than
Yeah.
that sort of setting. And what I guess the other thing that has really struck me is there's been a lot of focus on the growth of podcasting in terms of the number of people listening. But I
Mm,
think the thing that really hasn't been focused on quite enough is how much time people are spending with it. And so,
yeah.
even among just those who are listening to podcasts, their time spent listening to podcasts, to your point, has doubled within the past few
Hmm.
years. And it's just been remarkable to see that happening. So it's not just more people, it's more people spending more time with the
Yeah.
medium, which is a fascinating time to be in.
Yeah, and I like to think this, and you tell me, Will, because other people sometimes think I'm crazy and this is what I do, so it's okay. But this is the way I view it. And you've been doing this longer than me. You've been in business longer than me. I'm only 8 years in, so I'm a baby. That
Yeah,
being said, this is the way I view it. YouTube, I mean, give or take on the numbers on this, not holding you or me to these. So anybody listening, I don't want to emails. Oh, that's the wrong number. Whatever. It's okay.
right.
YouTube,
That's right.
150 million plus channels out there. Whatever. Active, not
Yeah,
active. Who cares? You Google it, it's going to come up maybe 150 million. Podcasts,
that's
3
right.
million. I'm rounding one way or another. Who cares? We don't need to be exact.
Sure,
My
sure.
my view is based off of the way that, ad dollars are coming to the industry, based on increase in technology, based on more hosts of higher calibers. And I just mean known names, that celebrities,
Yep,
entertainers, other things like that. Accessibility because of technology, easier to podcast now, to launch a podcast, easier to grow, just all these other things, AI, whatever. We don't have to go into all that. But this is the question. Long way to tee it up. Hang in there with me, Will. The
that's
question
all
to
right.
me is what I'm always evangelizing is I want everybody to start a podcast. I don't know if it's going to be 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. I don't know. But to think that there's not going to be over 50 million podcasts, if there's
Yeah,
150 million plus YouTube channels, I think
yeah,
we're in like year 1 or 2, if I'm
yeah.
being liberal, of YouTube, where you couldn't even
Oh,
upload a video that was more than 10 minutes. Am I crazy?
yeah.
Am I crazy?
No,
Or what
I,
would you
I,
say? What would you
I
add
mean,
or whatever?
here's the thing. We don't know each other that well, so
Yeah.
maybe you're crazy. I don't know the answer to that, but I don't think you're crazy for this statement. I mean, that's one of my favorite things about the field of podcasting is we are really getting to that point, although just scratching the surface in a way that people are recognizing podcast can be used for very specific needs of saying, I'm interested in the following field and I would love a 12-part series on this very specific thing.
Mm,
And I think that you're going to see more and more of that. We get a bit of a view into that. iHeart owns one of the platforms for really more independent podcasters called Spreaker. And it's very interesting for us to see it as almost like the development leagues for podcasting, and we see the podcasts that are starting up in this space and the number of people coming into
mm,
it and launching very interesting podcasts, and they may ultimately say, you know what, my podcast is for 250 people out there, but
Yeah.
250 people that are very interested in this very specific thing. I love it. It just becomes a great form of communication and way for people to access such interesting knowledge.
I love it too. And I like that you bring that up, even limited series or other things like that, because there's all these. And what I preach is that, there's so many people that have so much knowledge in different areas. And it's like, unlike, let's just say, and I'm not saying, influencers, good, bad, or otherwise. I just mean like, unlike, let's say, an influencer culture on Instagram. Again, I
Yeah.
like Instagram, but I'm just saying, like, where we're just looking at a particular number. In this case, you get to connect and you get to build communities, but actual communities around
Yep.
even
Yep.
shows. And that
Yep.
happens very, like in our case, it was organic. Like I mentioned, I've done, over 6,000 interviews plus, and that was not on purpose. Like that wasn't by
Yeah.
design. That was by demand for the community. We just didn't want to tell our
Right.
community, like the business leaders and other people, we didn't want to tell them no. So we ended
Yep.
up like pivoting and building an entire business and infrastructure around serving our community. But that
Yeah.
wasn't intentionally. And I see all of these other communities that have built up around podcasts and shows.
Mm.
What does community mean to you in this space or otherwise? Like that's where I'm going with it because I've just seen it and I'm curious from what you've seen.
Yeah, I mean, I think it can mean a number of different things, but back to this idea of just what
Mhm.
a an intimate medium it is, what that creates is not only that strong connection between the host and the listener, it actually creates this pretty terrific bond among, those listeners of that show. I'm sure you've seen this as well, but when you meet two people that are into the same podcast, the spark that's in their eyes when they get a chance
Yeah.
to realize this and then talk about it, that connection is really, really strong. It's fun
Mhm.
for us to see it happen across various podcasts. Stuff You Should Know, again, one of our oldest shows, has this community that calls itself the Stuff You Should Know Army, which is sort of a funny thing to call itself because it's a very passive and nerdy group, but I think that's part of the reason they enjoy calling it that. But it's just amazing to watch this bond among them. And when these shows go and do, live shows in different places and they're touring, what's remarkable is the way that fans or listeners rather interact with the talent. You can see the bond that they feel, that in a lot of ways they'll just walk up and start talking to them
Yeah.
like they're their friends because of
Yeah.
the nature of that. And the same thing among listeners. And so that community that's built among these various podcasts and the connection that these listeners feel for each other and among each other is pretty awesome to see. It's really sort of touching to watch it in action.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting to see that. And it's interesting that you say that, especially live events and things like that. I know that if there's any you care to bring up, of course, whether events that have passed recently or forward that
Yeah.
that you're working on, whatever you like to, but I just want to just touch on at least the in-person like component of podcasting because I know we've been doing a little bit more, just little by little, like in person and like hosting events and things like that. But I know on a big level, you're bringing together other communities and providing that platform as well. Do you want to maybe speak on
Yeah.
that a little bit?
Yeah, this is something that, was starting to grow pre-COVID. Obviously, COVID put a pause on various things, but it's been really fun to see the community start to gather again. Actually, just this past weekend, just a few days ago in Atlanta, we had the second annual Black Effect Podcast Festival. So the Black
Wow.
Effect is a joint venture between iHeart and one of iHeart's top personalities on the radio side, Charlemagne the God, co-host of The Breakfast Club.
Hmm.
And so this joint venture has launched 30 plus podcasts in the space, recognizing a few years ago the underrepresentation among Black listenership and talent in the space, and really trying to address that in a meaningful way. And so now seeing that a few years later, as this has grown, being able to say, you know what? The fans want to be able to gather. The fans want to
Yeah.
be able to see the talent up close and personal. The talent want to be able to communicate with each other. And so being on the ground there, sort of being able to step back for a second and just watch the joy on these
Mm.
fans' faces. But they're there for so many different reasons. Some are just there for entertainment purposes.
Yeah.
Some are there to meet other people. Some are there for networking purposes. And so it's really just fun to see all the various reasons why people may want to be there in person, but just standing there among a few thousand fans of podcasts and these talent, it just, I don't know,
Like in
there's
the
a
past,
few
you would have
better
only
feelings
seen
than
that
that.
for like a musician, right? Like, or like
Right.
one of your music festivals or something else where you're like thousands of people come out, but for them to come out for a podcast, like to me, that's surreal.
That's
Like
right.
that's a
Yeah.
cultural phenomenon. That's surreal.
It's really just an amazing thing to see in action. So yeah.
I want to jump around just a little bit here because obviously
Mhm.
one of the revenue models for podcasting, whether it's for networks or otherwise, is going to be advertising or any media, right?
Yeah.
What do you think? Everything that I read, trends, data, otherwise, says, more money's flowing into this, from the advertising and brand standpoint, I'm speaking of specifically. And it's pretty sticky, like advertisers or otherwise. So not
Yeah.
naming having you call out any specific brand or putting you on the hook for any of that or anything
Sure.
like that. But what do you think makes it so sticky? Because I didn't know much about radio in the past, so I'm just curious. Like,
Yeah.
does it have the same stickiness as radio, or are they different? Like, just anything you want to comment on that.
Audio is a very powerful medium, and
Mm,
it's actually been interesting over the past couple of years to see several ad agencies and other third parties come in and do studies around really across several different mediums. So from audio to social media to TV to print to all the different forms of media, and the recall that happens from audio is really, really powerful. And sort of the
mm,
recognition and the connection that comes from that is actually pretty remarkable to see the science back it up, that more than any other medium, audio sticks with people. And it makes sense when you tell somebody a story, when you communicate a
yeah.
thing verbally, the theater of the mind is a very real thing and it brings it to life in their minds. And if I say the word home to you, you picture a very real thing, but what
Hmm.
you picture is completely different than the person sitting next to you. And it's interesting to see that in audio. And so that, again, back to this idea of that connection between the listener and the host makes it incredibly effective. So when that bond is created and then the host does an ad read or shares something
Mm,
from an advertiser, it creates that connection that goes through the ads as well. And so that's made it really, really effective. And the proof of that is in how the medium has grown from the types of advertisers that are coming in. And so if you back
mm,
up, 6 or 7 years ago and maybe even longer, the industry that really built podcast advertising and the industry itself was the direct response advertiser. These are your boxed
mm,
meal companies, your mattresses. When you think of all of these advertisers that came along to try to, to get people to purchase things, the only way they stuck around was if people were actually using those discount codes to go
oh,
buy
that
the
makes
thing. You
total
always think
sense.
like,
Yeah.
if you want this thing, use the discount code X when
Hmm.
you at checkout. And that became, and you started hearing these same advertisers over and over again with the
Ah,
stamps.com and any of the hiring agencies. The reason you were hearing them over and over again is because it was working. And
that
so it
makes
was
so
this
much
sort
sense.
of like well kept secret for a while. And then big brands started realizing, my gosh, these brands are spending so much money in podcasting and coming back to it. It must be working. And
Mm.
that's when the brands woke up to it and realized, oh, it's time for us to jump into the space. So it's been interesting to watch that, but it's really proof of just how effective the voice and
Hmm.
podcast advertising is.
Ah, that's amazing, Will. Will, I'm going to give you the final word here before we close out. What's next? I mean, what's next for you? What's next for iHeart Podcasting?
Yeah.
Like what's next?
As I mentioned before, one of the things that we're always trying to keep our eyes out for are audiences that feel like are not being served or their needs are not being met, and where there's an opportunity to bring shows into a certain space. And so it's no surprise over the past few months that the country has woken up to the excitement around women's sports. And,
Mm,
of course, the moments around Caitlin Clark and around the South Carolina basketball team and women's sports, and of course, the U.S. women's national soccer team, some incredible moments there. But this has been growing for a while here. Some people
mm,
think this has just happened out of nowhere. And so we announced last week in partnership, actually with one of those legends in the world of sports, the winningest player in WNBA history, Sue Bird, is
Mm.
part of a joint venture called Deep Blue. And we've partnered with them to announce that we'll be launching a slate of sports podcasts in the very near future. So in the second half of this year, you'll see several shows coming out from us in the world of basketball, in the world of tennis, in the world of
Mm.
soccer, golf, you name it. We are really going to be ramping up what we're doing in the space. But that's what I love about this job is the ability to have a team say, you know what, there's a very real need in this space. Let's jump in and let's
Mm.
go big and make sure that we're meeting the needs of the audience. So I think that's what I'm most excited about in the months ahead.
Amazing. And if people want to continue to follow the journey, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, of course, we distribute our podcast broadly. So anywhere people listen to podcasts, they
Hmm.
can find them. If people want to see a sampling of some of our specific podcasts, they can go to iHeartPodcast.com, check those out, or go to the iHeart app and check out podcasts there.
Yep.
But there's so many great shows out there, something for everybody. And we're just excited to continue on this journey.
Amazing. Will, well, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate you coming on and giving us the view of what's happening in podcasting. And I know you didn't confirm that I wasn't crazy. I'm not. It's okay. And I'm glad that you said at least my idea wasn't crazy, that there could be 50
That's
million,
right.
100 million podcasts. Okay, now I'm in. And to the audience, hey, thank you for your time today as well. If you haven't hit that subscribe button, this is your personal invitation. This is a daily show. Each and every day, we're bringing you new, amazing leaders and thought leaders in their fields, and we don't want you to miss a thing. So hit that subscribe. And Will, thank you again so much for your time.
Hey, thanks, Adam. Thanks for what you do. Take care.